Welcome, folks. Thank you for joining us on Socialist Telly once again. My name is Damien Willie, better known as Cornish Damo, here with a special guest to discuss the goings-on in the world around us, unraveling the spin and hopefully setting a few things straight. Today, we're talking Cuba. There are massive protests going on out there at the moment, the biggest, according to some reports, since the Cuban Revolution. And today, I'm delighted to be joined by Rob Miller from Cuba Solidarity and my old Socialist Telly mate, Steve from Squawk Box. Welcome, Rob. Welcome, Steve. How are you?
Good to see you, Damien. Good to see you, Steve. Thanks for the invitation.
You're very welcome. So who are Cuba Solidarity? Can you give us a quick overview of who you are and what you do?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I'm the director of the Cuba Solidarity Campaign. We're a UK-based political lobbying organisation that has around 4,000 members and about 500 affiliated trade unions, including all the main British trade unions are affiliated to the campaign. We campaign primarily against the US blockade of Cuba, which has been going on for 60 years. We campaign for the rights of the Cuban people to determine their own future free from outside aggression. We campaign against the illegal occupation by the United States at Guantanamo. And we support trade and scientific, educational, health exchanges between Britain and Cuba. So we want to support the British government when they work with the Cuban government, which they are doing at the moment. So we welcome that sort of cooperation. So we do all the usual things that most political campaigns would do. We publish magazines, briefings, we go to all the trade union conferences, we organise protests as and when, and we primarily focus our energies on lobbying the British government, British members of Parliament, to really make sure that British government policy is as positive as it can be towards this small Caribbean island of 11 million people. Before COVID, obviously, around 200,000 Brits would go to Cuba every year on holidays and would have an overwhelmingly great time and come back with good impressions. So millions of people from Britain know about Cuba. People over here know about their music, their dance, their arts, culture, and have a very positive feeling towards the island. But what we want to see primarily is the island being allowed to get out of the blockade, to be able to work towards developing its society the way that it wants to do it, the way the Cuban people want to do it. And to do that, they need to have good relations, positive relations, trading relations primarily with countries around the world. So Britain is key to that. We have a long-standing relationship with the island. British had a big investment in the Caribbean, as we know, over time. So there's lots of interrelations between Britain and Cuba. We want to see those developed and built upon. So that's really what we do as an organisation.
Fantastic. Now, for most people, I imagine, and well, I use myself as a loose example. Most people, when I say most people who haven't been to Cuba, when you ask people what they know about Cuba, you probably get responses along the lines of Fidel Castro, cigars, and that US blockade or embargo of the islands. And I'm going to start with that embargo, that blockade. It's the longest one. It's the longest trade embargo in modern history. It'll be 60 years old next year. How did this come to be? How did this treatment of Cuba by the US come into being, and how does that relate to what is going on in Cuba at the moment?
Okay, well, I mean, you're right about people, and I mean, everyone seems to know everything about Cuba, whether they've been there or not. You know, it's the one country in the world where everyone will give you their opinion immediately. It's quite fascinating, really. It's quite interesting for me, having worked with Cuba for 25 years, how people will tell me all about it. Even though I don't know where they get all the information from, but that's what 60 years of misinformation and propaganda does around the country. And most people see Cuba through that lens. You know, it's communist, it's Fidel, it's cigars, it's dancing. That's how they see it, you know, and it's a dictatorship is what they tend to see. So they start from that prism, and then everything else comes from that starting point. Obviously, there's a really complex history. In many ways, it's a beautiful history. I mean, pre-1959, the revolution, you know, Cuba was a dictatorship, a serious dictatorship run by Fulgencio Batista. They were criminals, they were gangsters. And all those films you see, the Goodfellas films and The Godfather and all that, you know, that's what it was like. It was casinos, it was brothels. And, you know, the mafia really moved into Cuba from America during the time of Prohibition. And they built up their empires there. They could sell alcohol, they could run clubs, casinos, drugs, cocaine. That's what Havana was like. It was a playground for the richer elements in the US, the gangsters in the US, and a whole kind of gangster mentality was basically dominating the economy in Cuba. 95% of the population were not living there. You know, they weren't benefiting from that at all. There was a hell of a lot of racism. There was a hell of a lot of poverty. There was no real state provision in terms of health or education. So society was very, very bad for the vast majority of people. It looks good in the Guys and Dolls film. You know, it looks good if you're in a casino and you can see the dancing girls. But generally, for most people in the country, it was terrible. It was a terrible situation. And it led to a series of uprisings, starting really, I suppose, in the modern term in 1953 with the assault on the Moncada barracks with Fidel and Raúl, and then leading right up to the revolution in 1959. And it was a popular revolution. You know, it was very, very popular across all sectors. And most people will know the stories of the bearded revolutionaries, you know, up in the mountains and Radio Cuba and all the kind of mystique of it all. That's what it was like. It was that kind of thing. And it became, they won in 59, and you see the pictures of them, you know, coming into Havana and the crowds coming out and welcoming them. And they, you know, they decamp into the hotel, the Hilton Hotel in the middle of Havana, and, you know, they take over and they become the popular government. The government of Batista, meanwhile, were packing their bags with all the money up, grabbing everything they could, everything they'd stolen from the Cuban people, and they decamped to Florida primarily, which is where many of them had holiday homes and had their connections in the United States. And alongside Batista, who fled with suitcases full of cash, many of the ruling class at the time, the plantation owners, the factory owners, got on the planes as well. They already had holiday homes in Florida. Florida's, you know, half an hour flight away. It's a bit like, you know, I'll pop over to the Isle of Wight for a bit, and when it's all over, I'll come back again. You know, it's a very easy thing to do. And the rich left, you know, something like 60% of the sort of middle class kind of administrators, doctors, scientists, and so on left the island at that time. But they all thought they'd be back. They all thought they'd be back maybe a month down the road, maybe 3 months, maybe 6 months, maybe a few years. As it's turned out, they haven't got back. And it's been nearly 60 years, as you said, or more than that now, since the revolution. And the bitterness and the anger from many of that community in Florida has just developed and developed and developed. And you see that on the footage every time anything like recent events happen in Miami, Florida, where people are out on the streets calling for the death of Raúl, or, you know, communists and whatever. So there's a very intense relationship between the Cuban Americans in Florida, and there's around about 1 million of them in total, and the Cubans on the island, of which there are like 11 million. And that kind of, it's almost a bit like a very bad family dispute going on. And that has really determined much of the foreign policy of the United States towards the island. Most US citizens really don't you know, care that much about Cuba. They quite like to go there on a holiday. And indeed, under Obama, thousands of them did, millions of them did, in fact. Went straight over there. It's in their culture as well to visit Cuba and go over there and see it. And it's around the corner. It's, you know, it's a very obvious place to go and visit if you're an American citizen. So the foreign policy of the US has been determined by that very hardcore group. Not all Cuban Americans, but they're dominated by a far right grouping. Left out, there's still a gangster element in there, a mafioso element in there. They've been involved in all sorts of activities across Latin America on behalf of the US State Department and CIA. They're a hard-line, dangerous mob, and they dominate Florida. And anyone who knows US politics knows that Florida is a key state. In any presidential election, you need to win Florida to become the president of the United States. And fraud in Miami in 2 successive elections. You know, the Cuban Americans don't just promise you the vote in Florida. They absolutely guarantee it. And you have to work, you have to accept their position, no matter how ludicrous it is. So you have, over the years, really seriously, like the little boy Eliane, who was kidnapped, you know, and kept prisoner over there, the shoot down of the planes. There's a whole history of provocations and activities between Florida and Cuba, which maintains this blockade and the political will of some sections in Florida. Bush, you know, Jeb Bush was governor of Florida. The links from that mob, and they're a powerful mob, the Cardi family, American Express family, lots of money, lots of links to the Republican Party. Under Bush, there were 14 Cuban Americans in the government, in the cabinet, essentially. And they still are there now. Marco Rubio, for example, the presidential candidate, is really pulling the strings over US policy at the moment. And that's why you have what is basically an anachronistic Cold War blockade with a little country which is no threat whatsoever to the United States. The United States trades with Vietnam, China, Saudi, whatever. But Cuba, they seem to have this one spot, and it's a spot caused by the Cuban Americans in Florida, and that's the key reasoning why we're in the situation we're in today, and why Cuba has suffered for 60 years. Just briefly on the blockade, after the revolution, Fidel went to the United States. So I think he went to the UN, and he met. He wanted to meet the president, and he met with Nixon in the end. And the Americans brushed him off, and so the Cubans had no choice but to start looking around the world for some other people who would trade with them. And obviously, the Soviet Union and the Eastern Bloc countries did. And it's the US who have really determined the situation vis-a-vis Cuba. They run the blockade. It's their own blockade. It's not multilateral, it's unilateral. And it's a very horrible blockade. And as you said rightly, it's the most vicious and longest blockade of any country in history outside of war.
Yeah, it doesn't look like it's going to end anytime soon on the basis of what you just told me there. I did. So obviously we were watching the US presidential elections quite closely, and we did. I must admit, I found it quite odd to try and, obviously not knowing a lot about the history of what was going on there, especially when the Florida race, because that was such a, as you say, rightly say, it's such a key seat, key state to win. That the Cuban population in Florida was so anti-Cuba in what they were saying, and I couldn't ratify this in my head. It was, this is the land of your forefathers kind of thing. Why do you believe that things are so bad out there? And it seems that the Batista era is almost a convenient image for the Americans to continue to propagandize, as if the revolution and the change that actually came with the revolution actually never happened, that actually the bad old days of Cuba are still what's there today, and that's a convenient image for them to keep on portraying, especially to the American people. Is that a fair analysis?
Well, I mean, it's the United States has never forgiven Cuba for taking a different path. Cuba is a socialist country, and they've thrown off the shackles of imperialism in the region. They have a national health service. They have free education from all the way through society. They have a social infrastructure, healthcare, social care for old people. They don't want privatization. The United States multinationals are unable to make money in Cuba. They did prior to the revolution, and that was the main thing. When the Bacardi family left, they lost their rum factory. When United Fruit Company left, they lost all the potential of the fruit. When the sugar companies left, they lost all their profits from the sugar companies. So multinational companies are unable to profit out of Cuba. They have a different path. Cuba is 90 miles away from the United States, and the United States has a very, well, it's called the Monroe Doctrine, which basically says if it's in our backyard, we run it. Cuba's in our backyard, so we run it. And you see it all the way across Latin America. Whenever a country, be it Chile or Nicaragua, rises up and it has their own determination to have their own president or their own political parties or their own political systems, which aren't dominated from the US, then the US will intervene. And they've intervened massively across the region. Millions of people have lost their life. Whenever a country has stood up and said, well, actually, that Bolivian gas belongs to the Bolivian people. Or, that Chilean nickel and copper belongs to the Chilean people. And that's really what you got. You get the coup in Chile with Pinochet and Allende. You get the terrible Contra war against the Nicaraguan people. And Cuba is no different. Venezuela, Cuba, Nicaragua today are still in the firing line because they dare to stand up against US imperialism in what is America's backyard. So that's one problem. It's the threat of a good example. And the United States have always feared some sort of domino effect of revolutions across Latin America, and they still fear it today. Then you've got the Cuban Americans, which we spoke about, who are the driving force for this terrible policy. And it's an ongoing situation. And I think it can change. And obviously we saw under Obama that there was a much saner approach, which was to engage with Cuba, talk to Cubans, have lots of people going backwards and forwards between Cuba and the United States. And what will be, what will play out. It's a very small island, it's not a big threat.
No, this is it. I mean, it's the largest island of the Caribbean, but that's not saying an awful lot, is it? But
to have an emphasis on it is a bit weird.
Yeah, the parallels with other countries in Latin America are are there to see. You've explained it perfectly well. Of course, one of the more high-profile examples we've seen or heard about in this country is of course, Venezuela and the sanctions that have been put in there. And Steve, I know you're more au fait with Venezuela than I am. Have you have probably picked up on that point as well?
Yeah, I mean, the particular thing of interest for me really with Venezuela has been the because I did some investigation into what was going on over there, seeing the contrast between how that was presented in the media and what was actually going on there. So you had this presentation on the BBC and other channels of, these kind of essentially, freedom campaigners out on the streets in mass numbers, demanding the downfall of the left-wing government in Venezuela, and big focus on all the food shortages and all the other hardships going on there. And yet once you looked at, it was kind of, if you I can't remember what it was, used to advertise like a cigar or a cigarette or something and say it was longer than the train because they would hold it up this close, and then the train was in the background and make out as though this cigarette was the size of the train or whatever because of the perspective. When you pulled back a bit from the perspective of the BBC's coverage, for example, of these supposed mass protests, you find that might have been a few thousand people, and you might have 100,000 people around the corner all protesting on for the government, and that was completely ignored. But they made this other one look really big. They went on about the food shortages, but they never mentioned the fact that it was actually right wingers and quite extreme right wingers in some cases that had control of the food import companies, and they were deliberately imposing these food shortages by refusing to bring stuff into the country, and in order to try to make the government look bad. And then you had the farce, of course, where the US and the UK, I think, have formally recognised a president who'd never been elected, and I think it was 82% of the people in Venezuela had never heard of. So that was an education to see how big a difference there could be between reality and how the situation is presented by the so-called mainstream media. So I'm interested full disclosure, I'm a member of the Cuba Solidarity Campaign, but I'm not an expert in the ins and outs of what's going on over there. I've never been. But I am very curious to pick Rob's brains about, what, we're seeing reports of, left wingers getting arrested for protesting, etc. But how much of what is getting reported bears any resemblance to what's really going on over there? So I'd be really interested in Rob's take on that.
I think what you've described is the classic US CIA playbook that they've used over and over and over again for many, many years. Soft coups, hard coups, whatever works, but intervention is the name of the game. And with Cuba and Venezuela and Nicaragua, they spend US citizens' tax dollars on subverting any participatory democracy or democratic outcomes in those countries. So in Cuba, they spend 20 million a year. That's publicly. That's what they announced publicly. Of course, they're spending a lot more than that elsewhere. On so-called democracy programs in Cuba. Well, democracy programs in Cuba are essentially intervention in a sovereign country, and they end up bankrolling people primarily in America, in Florida. So you have a whole cottage industry of anti-Cuban people who are paid to be anti-Cuban people. That's their life. That's the reason for being. They run radio programs. Journalists are paid. People are involved in so-called democracy programs paid for by the State Department. So there's thousands of people who are directly employed by the US government to be anti-Cuban. So that's where you get a lot of it from. And of course, some of that money goes into Cuba, and there are reports of, very basic things. You get $30 if you go out and you smash the window. You get $100 if you go out and pour some red paint on a statue of Che Guevara and film it and put it on Instagram. And this has been reported over and over again. Now, in a circumstance, a situation in Venezuela, in Nicaragua, or in Cuba, you can generate protests and you can generate disaffection. And that's been, as it's always been, in any progressive society, particularly ones close to the US, in the backyard of the United States. And we've seen it over and over and over again. And you rightly said, Chavez and Maduro, I think they won something like 14 different elections in the country. One guy, though, who's the self-declared president of Venezuela, didn't even win his own seat back. And this difference in the reality and what is presented in the mainstream media is ridiculous. I mean, last week, The Guardian, you know, so-called sensible newspaper, had a photo of anti-government protesters in Havana, and then they had to retract it when we pointed out to them that the photo was actually of pro-government demonstrators. They had to apologise. Now, that's just one example. You know, there is also all over the place. When Fidel Castro died, you know, they had endless images of Cuban Americans celebrating in Miami. They didn't have any images, or hardly any images, of the millions of Cubans who came out for the funeral, the cortege that went through the country. And, you know, it's a real crime of journalism in our country and the West, that people are journalists for whatever reason, and it's generally because they wouldn't get published if they put the other side of the story, that they're prepared to go along with, quite frankly, what they know is nonsense. And they do, because they wouldn't get published otherwise. And even if you get a really good piece in a newspaper, you've got a double page spread in a newspaper about the education services in Cuba, they always have to put in something about Fidel, dictatorship, one party state. So even if they do education, when we bring, I mean, I remember bringing a doctor over here. We just spent 6 months in Kashmir after the Pakistani earthquake. And we brought him over here to explain to the trade unions over here, you know, about Cuban international medical brigades. And we took him to various papers and radio stations. And the first question would be, oh, what was it like in Kashmir? The second question would be, what do you think about Fidel? What's going to happen when he dies? You know, what's going to... And you're thinking, well, this is a doctor. He's a doctor who's just been on an international mission. Why are you asking him that? And that's what I mean about the prism of Cuba, people looking at Cuba in a very particular way. They do with Venezuela, they do with Nicaragua. And if you go to those countries, what you actually find is a society which is working hard under very, very difficult circumstances to try and provide health services, education services, social services for their people. They might not get it right all the time, and no one's suggesting that these countries are perfect by any means. They all have their problems, as indeed every country in the world has its problems. However, you go to somewhere like Cuba or Nicaragua now, and you see, and Venezuela, you see a peaceful country with people trying their best in difficult circumstances to build schools, to educate, to have health services, teaching people to read and write. You know, the first thing the Cuban Revolution did was eradicate illiteracy. That was the very, very first thing they did. Now, you don't educate your population if you want to control them and, you know, you're a dictatorship. That's what happened in the dictatorship pre the revolution. It's not what's happening now. And even in these very difficult circumstances with these protests, you can see that the government and the people and the president went to the very first protest and met the protesters. You know, it's not that there's not a dialogue. There is a dialogue, and the dialogue is continuing. People are pissed off. I'd be pissed off if, you know, I didn't have enough food. I had to queue up at 6 a.m. to go and get food. If the power cuts came on and it's summer and my fridge stops working and the aircon stops working in my workplace, or, you know, I'm waiting for my vaccines and I'm seeing pictures of people in hospital beds. I wasn't happy about it over here. I'm sure you weren't either. And people do protest. People protest all over the place. You know, South Africa today.
We could do with a bit more of that in this country, really, couldn't we?
Really,
More dissent, not naturally.
You know, people are unhappy. The problem with this situation is that the Western media and some elements will try and portray it as a sort of freedom thing, a dictatorship thing, an anti-communist thing. And there is an element of that, without a doubt, but that is by far and away not the main issue for these protesters. Their main concerns are that their daily lives and the difficulties they face. And we have to say very clearly, and we've been working on it very hard over the last few days, is to say, well, why are there these problems? Is it a question of dictatorship? Is it a question of bad government? No, far from it. It is a question of the United States blockade, which is vicious to the extent that even we, a British NGO essentially, backed by members of parliament, trade unions, are unable to transfer funds donated by British people to help the Cuban people. We've managed to do it, and we are doing it, but we have to do it by circumventing the blockade. And I'm not going to go into details about it, but that's the fact. The blockade is omnipresent and is very, very powerful. And there are a myriad of examples. The Cuban Solidarity Campaign had all our bank accounts shut down by the Co-op Bank, you know, a few years ago. Why? After questioning, because of the US blockade, they were fearful of the massive hundreds of $1 million fines issued by the Office of Foreign Asset Control, the US Treasury, against any international company that is trading with Cuba. Royal Bank of Scotland, £230 million fine. Lloyd's, £200 million fine. BNP Paribas, wait for this one, the French bank, $8.9 billion fine. And they paid it. I mean, the French president at the time, I think it was Hollande, stood up and said, no, we're not going to allow our French bank to pay this fine. They did. They did pay it. Even though the president...
What jurisdictions America got over them in that sense to be able to impose any kind of fines?
The jurisdiction, Steve, is the power of the US economy. You know, if you're the co-op bank, you want to trade with Cuba? Yeah, okay, we can trade with Cuba. Or do you want to trade with America? And, you know, the US dollar economy runs the globe. You know, unfortunately, everything goes around the same international systems. If you type in, if you try to, I mean, a woman got in touch with us a few months back. She'd put on eBay a little bracelet, little trinket that she'd bought in Cuba a few years previous. She had it on eBay for 99p. And I don't know why people do that sort of thing, but they do. So she was selling this little bracelet thing, Cuban bracelet, 99p on eBay. Within 4 hours of her putting the bracelet up on eBay, she had a message from eBay to take down the Cuban trafficked goods, or they would shut down her eBay shop. This is ongoing. You got little coffee shops in Perth. They had Cuban coffee on sale. Again, they were contacted by PayPal. Stop selling Cuban coffee or you won't be able to use PayPal. We've just been banned from Just Giving, which is a charitable way of giving money to causes. We had a Just Giving site, which we've used for years to raise funds for all sorts of projects in Cuba. Shut down by Just Giving because of the blockade. The blockade is omnipresent. A few years ago, a couple of years ago, in fact, a young Cuban student who was living in the UK, he'd done a degree at a university, Westminster over here, who was recommended by his lecturer or professor, whatever, to do a PhD. He applied for the Open University on a recommendation, and the Open University refused his application. When he got in touch with him, he said, is it because I haven't got the money? No, that's not the problem. Is it because I haven't got the right documents, you know, status? No, that's not the problem. Under questioning, they finally wrote back and said it's because of the extraterritorial US blockade. We run a huge campaign. Over 200 members of parliament wrote to the government. All the trade unions, Unison, Unite, the teaching unions, lecturers unions got involved. And eventually, we had a huge campaign. It was in the media and everything. We had to take a legal case on behalf of the student. We took the legal case on the question of race discrimination under the 2010 Equalities Act, because it was basically saying all Cubans can't come to the Open University. Ridiculous. Now, we won the case and we got a financial settlement for the student, and the student ended up going to the Open University a year later. But it just shows you the level to which Cuba is under scrutiny in the United States by the Office of Foreign Asset Control to block any trade or exchange or contact with the island. It's a blockade which is cruel, illegal, it's been condemned at the United Nations. And the worst thing I think about it is it's a bit like the US have got their hands around the neck of the Cuban people. And then they complain that the Cuban people aren't breathing properly. You know, it's a terrible, terrible blockade. And I do feel for the Cuban people at this moment in time, because they are trying to do their best in what is an impossibly difficult situation.
God forbid the US ever be portrayed as the bad guy in anything, frankly. But that's frankly what it comes down to, isn't it? I mean, they're always in the right. Their way must be right because they're big and they're powerful and they're rich, and they've got media people that are going to speak out and toe a given line that they want to portray. Our media is no different. That's why outfits such as ours have sprung up, because we're sick and tired of it as well. The OU, a socialist creation, pulling this stunt just shows how far down the rabbit hole this country has gone, quite frankly.
I'm sure a lot of it has to do with their proximity to the US as well, because, you know, they've got to keep their Cuban kind of exiles happy or whatever, but also, you know, it wouldn't do for the US to see a country that adopts a completely different set of standards and values.
I mean,
thrive on their doorstep. You know what I mean? That would be a major embarrassment.
I mean, the driving force for the OU was they have this sort of mass education program called Future Learn, which is like a so-called free kind of education program, and that's all an online thing, which you pay for elements of it using sort of PayPal or various payment programs. And of course, those payment programs won't have Cuba as one of the things, because they are the ones that are worried about the now in those circumstances. What the Open University should have done would be, well, we won't use that payment program. We'll find a payment program that does not discriminate, because there are some that will accept Cuba, some European ones or Canadian ones, but they didn't. Instead, they just took PayPal and don't do Cuba and applied it to students in a discriminatory way. And that's what drove it. So they had to back down and apologize and change their policy, not least because we'd written to about 120 other institutions, universities, asking them if they were Cuban students. And of course, they all had to say yes. So we were able to say, well, the Open University are the only one discriminating against Cuban students. Yeah. So you have to understand the levels of the blockade legislation. It's not just about US and Cuba. Coming back to your one point, I think someone made, why it's a blockade rather than an embargo, is because it is extraterritorial. So it applies on individuals and companies across the globe. If you don't do what the US says, then you can be fined, you can be locked up, you can be sanctioned yourself, and you certainly can be excluded from the US economy. So it is a blockade for that reason.
Yeah, I can't help but think it all comes down to the fact that they have a completely different government structure and they won't embrace capitalism. The fact that Cuba is a one-party state, that it doesn't follow a system like ours or the US where rival parties vie for a vote. So on the face of it, it's very easy to paint Cuba, I suppose, as undemocratic because it's a strange and an alien concept the way they're running their country. And world media certainly does this. Several UK papers covering this protest recently, the protests that are going on. And you mentioned the Guardian earlier. I know there's about 3 or 4 of them all did the same thing. I think the Financial Times was another one, but using a stock image of a pro-government rally and painting it as the complete opposite. I mean, how democratic a country is Cuba? What is its system? And is this just a gripe the West have had because they've gone their own way?
Well, just before I take on the question of the democratic system in Cuba, the issue about the one-party state or democracy in Cuba, the United States, I hate to say it, they don't really care about that. The United States trade with all sorts of countries. We know which countries they are, which are far from anything to do with democratic. Some of them are despotic states in the Middle East. They don't care about democracy or human rights. That's not their purpose. They do care about the domino effect of what might happen in the region, and they care about the fact that Cuba does not allow multinational corporations to make a profit out of it. And that's fundamentally what they care about.
Less about democracy and more about capitalism.
When have they ever cared about democracy? I hate to say it, They don't care about democracy.
Well,
If
you look at Venezuela again.
I mean,
Venezuelan example.
Whatever you want, I mean, it's Allende was elected. He didn't take it. It wasn't a revolution. He was elected, and then he was killed, and millions of people were locked up and tortured. And Thatcher, Pinochet, it's there in front of you. They don't care about democracy or human rights. And in this particular situation, some people in Florida are calling for humanitarian intervention, to help the Cuban people, which essentially means, U.S. Marines going over to Cuba to make some sort of humanitarian corridor, as if we're in a war situation. If the US wants to help the people of Cuba, if anyone, in fact, wants to help the people of Cuba in America or here, the best thing they should be calling for is for the United States to lift or suspend elements of the blockade so that the Cuban people can buy food, can buy medicines and so on from the United States, where they can get it really cheap because it's just over the doorstep. At the moment, they're having to buy everything around the world through sanctions busting operations who are charging them 2, 3, 4 times as much for the very same products. And I know that because I'm having to try and find a lot of the products to get over to Cuba, which is what they're asking for. At the moment, we're trying to find children's, I can't remember the name of them now, but special things to get blood in and out of kids because they're short of them.
And butterflies.
Exactly, butterfly things. Yeah, exactly. Trying to find those is very, very difficult. As soon as you mention Cuba, you are in big, big trouble. And so that is the problem. For the Cubans, it's a serious problem. Now, moving on to the democratic process in Cuba, it's different. It's very, very, very different. In my opinion, it's far better. But that's my opinion. You don't have to have, it's not about whether you support the system they've got in Cuba or you don't. It's about having a country and allowing that country to determine its own future. And that's the key crux of the matter. In my personal opinion, they have politics in Cuba is omnipresent. People are involved in politics from school level, where they have school councils, to university levels where everyone's involved. The student union have members of parliament, to the trade unions. You can't go to Cuba without seeing the Cubans in another meeting. They are meeting all the time. They are arguing and disagreeing and talking politics. It goes on everywhere, from the Committees for the Defence of the Revolution to the Women's Federation to the trade unions to the students. It's a participatory system, one that I'm sure a lot of us would like to see more of over here, where people are actively engaged in politics. They don't just do it every 5 years or whatever and put the cross on the bit of the paper, but it's an ongoing, everyday process of trying to improve your lives at work, at home, at school, in the health service and so on. They have elections every 4 or 5 years to their National Assembly. So they have provincial assemblies, which are basically councils, local councils. And then they have elections to the National Assembly. They have 600 odd members of the National Assembly. The National Assembly then elects its Council of State, which is like its cabinet, which in turn then elects its prime minister. So you've got that system. And Cuban members of parliament have visited Westminster. We hosted a delegation a couple of years ago with 16 Cuban members of parliament who met with Tories, Liberals and Labour members over here in a interparliamentary union exchange. So they have members of parliament. They are elected in a very different way. They don't have a multi-party system, and they certainly don't have a multi-party system which is based on anything like we have or in America, where you need to have billions of pounds to participate. So they have a system where anyone can stand at a local level. You place your information up on the board and people look at it and they choose accordingly who they're going to vote for. So most people are elected on the basis of what they do locally, what they, what skills they have, what they say in their programs. It's a very, very different system. But I would not want to be in a situation where I stand over here knowing our democratic system, our House of Lords, our unelected hereditary systems that we've got, our Queen, our royal family, our aristocracy, our media, the money. I wouldn't want to stand here and tell the Cubans how to run their system. It's their country, it's their system. We may or may not agree with it, but it is their country and they need to evolve that over time as they want to do without foreign aggression. So I think the key thing from here is to say, well, you don't have to agree with everything in Cuba. That's certainly not what the Cuba Solidarity Campaign is saying. And there's lots of people in CSU who disagree with many elements or some elements, I don't know, of what is going on over there. However, at the end of the day, it is their country. And it's for the Cuban people to decide their future. And we have to respect that and defend that right. And that's the key element, really, of internationalism, of solidarity, of socialism. And I think if we stick to those principles, it's a very good starting point to understand what's going on in Cuba over the last 60 years and today.
Steve, you wanted to
come in? The democracy element's a bit of a joke, really, because, yes, Cuba runs its affairs how it does. But, as you've mentioned about the US being quite fond of despots when they're friendly to the US, But, the Venezuelan elections were consistently attacked by the media in America and here as being anti-democratic or, dodgy elections. And yet when the independent election assessors were there to watch the whole thing going on, they came back with a glowing report and said it was one of the best in the world in terms of its transparency, its security, its reliability, and actually far better than we've got in the UK or the US for that matter. So, and then in Venezuela, they were happy to, acknowledge an unelected president when it suits them. So it's a lot of bollocks, frankly, what they, that the sort of stuff they spout on those issues. It's really that, if a country inconveniences the US, and to the degree that the UK is the US's poodle, it'll follow along. The more you inconvenience them and threaten, the perception that they're always right, then the more likely you are to get attacked. But I think it's, I'm personally of the opinion that the democracy in this country is fundamentally broken. Not least because the media are, either cowed by or in many cases suborned by or are the same people that are running the government at the minute. So there's no effective challenge by the media, and the democracy can't function without that.
Yeah, I totally agree with you. I think democracy is good. You support a democratic system if you win, and if you don't like the results, then you criticise it and look for a different system. We ourselves had a left-wing, leader of the Labour Party over here, a socialist leader of the Labour Party, and they were never going to allow Corbyn or a left-winger like Corbyn to become prime minister. I didn't think, under any circumstances. I just didn't think that was possible. And the situation developed such that it didn't become. They threw everything at him, and democracy is there to use and to have that situation or that vision of, oh, we're great democracy, this, that, and the other. But when you look into it, you can see that the American government don't give a hoot about democracy. Else they wouldn't be working hand in glove with Saudi Arabia, for example. But you can go on and on and on over the history of the so-called US democracy. The situation of who can participate. The number of people in America who can't really access that kind of area. The racism in America. You can go into lots of different areas, and you do start to question just quite how democratic it is. And then when people use this democracy stick to beat countries like Nicaragua or Venezuela, or in this case, Cuba, you have to start to question, well, actually, is it really about that? Is it really about looking after the people of Cuba, democracy? Do you really want to help them with food and medicines? Because quite frankly, you're the people who are stopping them getting food and medicine. So it just doesn't really add up. And people, I like to think that when people are given the information, they're intelligent enough to see through a lot of this. And I think, in this particular case with Cuba right now, you are getting people to realise that, hang on a minute, this is not quite this sort of mass popular uprising that was being portrayed in The Guardian. And certainly today in Cuba, the streets are calm, the situation is calm, people are talking, the government are talking to the people, there have been some changes made. People will need to move forward together in Cuba. And I think the one thing about Cubans is that they are all Cubans, they're all in it together. And there's a lot of social solidarity across Cuba, which I think will see them through it. I hope it does.
Yeah, we'll mention democracy purely on the basis we believe we live on one. It's a very interesting system, actually. Who'd have thought? What a fantastic idea, just having ordinary people able to stand for election and not have to be rich and do it, and not having to have wealthy backers and having all these people behind you to advertise you and push you and all the rest of it. You just put your name on a notice board with a list of things that you'd like to do and see if people quite like the sound of it. I mean, is that not democracy in action itself? I mean, that seems to be the very epitome of democratic thinking to my mind. But you raise perfectly valid points that, what the US is doing and the people they do deal with around the world, that's not democratic. Interfering in other elections, that's not democratic. And we're complicit in it when we sit by and say, well, yes, look at how awful they are, aren't they terrible? As we did with Venezuela, as the US were doing what they were doing. And when you have a media that just pushes that narrative consistently, rather than actually do proper journalism, such as Steve does, then no wonder that people think the way they do and believe what they believe. Oh, aren't we a fantastic democratic nation? Aren't those Cubans awful? Yeah. Listen to listen to the facts. Listen to this show. Do your own research and listen to what Cuba Solidarity have to say on their website as well. I'll move on. In recent days, we've got to move on to these protests that are happening because they are currently in the news at the moment. And we've seen in recent days these protests going on. The last year has been pretty tough on the Cuban economy as it has everywhere else due to the COVID crisis. There does seem to be some legitimate case against the Cuban government at the moment, and that food and medicines we're told are no longer blockaded. But although the Cubans have developed their own vaccine, it hasn't been rolled out very well. The health system, despite actually being very good, I believe they've got the highest doctor to patient ratio in the world there, was unable to cope. Apparently only 15% of the population have been vaccinated to date. The government are being accused of refusing to bring medicine in from outside. The people are desperate, need food, need medicines, claim to not be being heard. Yet the Cuban government is saying that these protests are US backed. Are they right? Is this more US interference, which is entirely believable by this point in the show? Or are we being misinformed here? Or is there a version of democracy in Cuba failing now? And are there people suffering needlessly out of Cuban pride?
No, is the answer. But let's start with the COVID thing. I mean, there is a lot of misinformation, and it's obviously being churned out left, right, and centre. If you look at the facts, Cuba miraculously has developed its own vaccines. They have 5 vaccine candidates, and 2 have now been trialled and are being used right now. They're the only country in Latin America to have their own vaccine. or vaccines. And the two vaccines they're using, one's called Abdala and one's called Soberana, are being rolled out to date. And these are the figures. 1.9 million people have had all 3 doses. It's a 3-dose injection program. 3 million people have had 1 or more vaccines. So you're talking about a very high level. And the idea is to have the whole population vaccinated by the end of the year, which will be a first in the world if they get there. So they are rolling it out, and they're rolling it out in very, very difficult circumstances. There's a shortage of needles, and around 5 million syringes have been donated so far across the globe from solidarity organisations and governments to Cuba, and I'm sure they will overcome those problems. We ourselves have sent some raw materials for vaccine production, which were needed over there, which they couldn't get. So, people are helping in all sorts of different ways, but they are running a social system. As you said, they've got the highest doctor ratio in the world. I think it's 3 times as many doctors per person than we have in this country. And so to do a vaccine rollout is something they can do very quickly and very efficiently. There are family doctors in every neighborhood. People go to the doctors regularly, too regularly often in Cuba, because they see it as a fundamental kind of right. If you look at the actual facts, Cuba did incredibly well with COVID over the period of time. In the last couple of months, they've seen a spike, and it's difficult for them. But even today, and these are the statistics, even today, 10th of July, comparing Cuba with the United States, one of the richest countries in the world, the United States death rate is currently about 1,800 per million people. The Cuba death rate is 139 per million people. So that's about 10 times or more better than the United States. They're the facts right now. And the same is true in terms of case numbers and so on. So it isn't true that Cuba is facing a terrible health crisis with COVID. What is true is that in the circumstances they find themselves, where their health service is not geared up to this kind of situation, the country is very poor, there's not enough food, there's not enough transport, there's not enough fuel. It's a very, very concerning situation for Cuban people who are used to something very different. They are used to a health service which provides on a daily basis for them from birth to death, has produced the best infant mortality rates in the region, better than the United States, has life expectancy rates on a par with Britain and Europe, in a country which is a developing country. And if the best thing to do with something like Cuba and COVID or health service is to compare it not with Britain and America and France, but to compare it with something like Haiti or Peru or countries in the region. And then you will see that if you're a poor person in a lot of those countries, and you see it so often when you see demonstrations in Chile or Colombia or wherever, you'll see pictures of Che Guevara or the Cuban flag. You see Che Guevara across, demonstrations across the globe. If you're poor in the foothills of the Andes or something, and you get ill or your children get ill, you can't see a doctor. No. You can't pay for a doctor. You haven't got the money. And there aren't enough doctors because the doctors are in the cities, not in the rural areas. If you're poor in those places and your child wants to be, a dancer or a scientist, you've got no hope of getting your kid into a school or university because you can't pay for it. And those facilities aren't there. So those poor people across the region, in Latin America and beyond, they look at Cuba from a very different perspective to how you or me look at Cuba. Because they can see Cuba, if my kids get ill, I can get a doctor. If my kid wants to go to school and become a mathematician, I can get them into school. That, if you're poor, is a bit of a nirvana situation. You think, well, bloody hell, that's the basics. That's what I want in life. I'm not bothered about foreign holidays or this, that, or the other, or Nike trainers. I want education. I want health. I want food. I want a stable situation where my children, my family can live and get educated and flourish. Now, that is the situation in Cuba. However, they're in a very, very difficult situation right now. The idea that they're not doing all they can to provide for the health services for their people is a nonsense. They have always done that, and they will continue to do that against very difficult circumstances, using a very sensible primary care, preventative medical approach, which tries to stop people getting ill in the first place, rather than using high-tech, very expensive very expensive drugs from pharmaceutical companies that are ripping us all off left, right and centre. They have a preventative system which is based on immunisation. It's about seeing your doctor regularly, living well and looking after yourselves and making sure that those treatments, you don't waste resources on people who are getting ill when you can stop them from getting ill in the first place. So Cuba does very, very well in those circumstances. So that's the health situation.
It's worth pointing out as well, I think that, right at the beginning of the COVID crisis, when Italy was having a terrible time, there were brigades of doctors going across from Cuba to help with the treatments in Italy. And if I remember correctly, some of the treatment protocols, which have since brought the death rates down from people who do get infected with the virus, were first developed in Cuba as well and spread because the Cubans, sent details out to other countries in order to do their bit.
They've sent over 40 medical brigades internationally to countries around the world. And interestingly, not Italy, but also Andorra in Europe. So they were asked, it wasn't like they were sent, they were asked by those governments to come over. Mm-hmm. Even the British government have cooperated with the Cubans to get medical brigades into British overseas territories in the Caribbean, like Anguilla, Virgin Islands, there's Montserrat, I think, there's another one, I can't remember them all, but there's 4 British kind of, I don't know, Britain still has these kind of relationships with little Caribbean islands. So it's like a bit of a protectorate with a governor and all that sort of stuff. So these are British overseas territories, British government facilitating or asking the Cubans to help out, to help the health services in those countries. It's not just now, of course, it's been going on for years. The Ebola crisis in West Africa, the World Health Authority, they asked the Americans, the British and the Cubans to send medical brigades to help in West Africa. And it's been going on for all the way through the Cuban Revolution. The Cubans have treated tens of thousands of Chernobyl victims, completely free of charge. Operation Milagro across Latin America has treated about 4 million cataract operations across Latin America. The list goes on and on and on. Cuban internationalism is an incredible thing on a medical front, but also, obviously the history of South Africa. And the Cuban troops fighting the South African Defence Forces in Angola and turning the tide of the South African anti-apartheid struggle. So much so that when Mandela was released, the first foreign country he visited was Cuba to thank the Cuban people. And that kind of history is not told, and there's Fidel and Mandela hugging in a manner. And Mandela says, I'd like to thank the Cuban people for the freedom of South Africa, because you shed your blood on the battlefields of Quito Carnivale against the up to then invincible South African Defence Forces. And that turned the tide of the defeat of anti-apartheid. So Cuba has an incredible history, both medically, but also internationally, solidarity. And, it's times like this where people need to look back at the history and say, well, actually, I'm proud to be in solidarity with Cuba, and not least to pay back some of the international solidarity that the Cuban people have given around the world over so many years.
Yeah, I mean, I've got some more statistics actually, because I was going to come on to healthcare, but you've answered it so wonderfully, because they really do have a very altruistic attitude towards healthcare from Cuba. 2,400 medics sent to Pakistan after their 2005 earthquake. 40% of those injured in the 2010 Haitian earthquake were treated by Cuban medics. They train doctors to go and work in the US as long as they choose to practice in underprivileged areas. And you mentioned West Africa and Ebola, 250 healthcare workers were sent over there. It's an incredible thing that they choose to do. It's not like they're getting anything out of it. It's just they're doing it for the betterment of mankind. And they've got a fantastic, as you referred to it earlier, as a national health service. And the thought occurred to me is at the end there, is especially in light of what happened yesterday with the health and care bill here in this country, as to what the Cubans might be thinking of what is happening to our health care system, as highly regarded globally as it is. I wonder what they think of what we're doing here with ours.
The Cuban Health Service was based on the National Health Service. But the differences now are profound, certainly in terms of things like bed numbers, numbers of beds per population. I've seen Cubans shocked at the level of the infrastructure that is available in Britain, in a wealthy country, really. They are quite shocked about things like resources in case of emergencies. And we've seen that recently. So, yeah, there are lots of differences. Anyway, I mean, at the end of the day, I don't think the Cubans would comment really on other people's health services. Right,
Ironically.
they've got enough to worry about themselves, you know. So it's a difficult time. I mean, I know we're running out of time. I'd just like to obviously thank everyone who's listening and who sees this. You know, if you want to help the people of Cuba, there's really two things you can do. One is join us in the campaign calling on the United States to lift or suspend elements of the blockade. That is the problem for Cuba. The second thing you can do is donate to the Cuba Solidarity Campaign fundraising appeal for COVID-19, which has raised nearly £100,000 now since the start of COVID to send vital medical aid to Cuba. And I'm sure you can post up the links to that COVID appeal. That would be two definite ways of helping the people of Cuba now, and also finding out for yourselves a bit more about it before pronouncing your judgment on exactly what's going on in
Which,
Cuba.
of course, you can on your website, which is cuba-solidarity.org.uk, which I would encourage people to go and have a look at, join, donate, buy the merchandise, read up on the enormous amount of resources that are on that website. Rob Miller, thank you so much for your time today to talk to us about that. And thank you, Steve, for your time as well. Take care, folks. Thanks for watching.
Thank you both.
Thank you.